Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to day 2 of Mom 5. I'm Christina Wint, Program Manager for Women's Health at AMCHIP. AMCHIP is thankful for our partnership with the CDC on the Erase MM initiative and the opportunity to assist in the hosting and planning of this meeting. We have heard some of your initial feedback from day 1 and are so glad that you are enjoying the conference platform, that the plenary and concurrent session content is really resonating with you, and that you enjoy the opportunity to meet and network with your peers in the breakout rooms. It's really great to hear. I want to express gratitude for the individuals who have contributed to ensuring that yesterday and today goes smoothly. Thank you to Lisa Nelson and her team at Seeing Colors, including Natasha Pollard, Liz Caruso, Jennifer Clark, Sheila Fox, Sunny Ben Belkacem, and the many other producers and planners working behind the scenes to ensure that this event goes smoothly. We are so thankful to you and for you. So please help me in just conveying thanks to them in the chat. We have an action-packed first plenary, so I will be keeping my comments brief. So I encourage you to familiarize yourselves with the powerhouse speakers joining us for our conversation, Strategic Storytelling for MMRCs, in the networking tab of the conference platform. You will not regret it. In yesterday's breakouts, the desire to personalize and honor the experience of the lives lost arose as a common theme. Mr. Kenn Harris, Dr. Peck, and Dr. Janelle Palacio are faculty members on the National Center for Fatality Review and Prevention Fetal Infant Mortality Review Storytelling Project. Together, they hold a combined more than 80, almost 90 actually, years of combined public health, equity, and storytelling experience, and are really excited for this opportunity of synergy with Maternal Mortality Review, and to join you and work with you in this desire to respect and honor the lives of those who we've lost. Starting off is Kenn Harris. Kenn is the Executive Project Director and Engagement Lead at the National Institute for Children's Health Quality, supporting the Healthy Start Performance Project. As I shared, he is one of the faculty members on the Storytelling Project and will be kicking us off as we go into this conversation. With that, I turn it over to Kenn. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Christina. Again, I'm Kenn Harris, and I am at NICHQ, as you've heard, and Magda, Janelle, and I would like to begin with gratitude, and thank you for this honor of being with you today. Again, I've been at NICHQ for quite a while. I've spent over 30 years in MCH, fatherhood, and community engagement, and I'm currently, as you heard, the Executive Project Director and Engagement Lead at NICHQ, and overseeing the Healthy Start TA and Center for the 101 Healthy Start grantees around the country. During this time, we hope to answer 2 questions, the 3 of us. One is, why story? 2, why story is so powerful? I've been blessed to be a part of that dream team for that Fetal Infant Mortality Review Storytelling Project for the past year, with our colleague, Rosemary Forner, and a host of other MCH colleagues from around the country. So here's what I've been able to learn and experience with Magda and Janelle, and we hope that you're going to experience this today with their stories. So story shifts, it shifts experiences. Story shapes, it can help shape understanding. You can even relaunch life through storytelling. I've learned that when you integrate story into this work, you have to do it with integrity, you have to do it with respect, and you have to do it with honor. For story is sacred currency. And I believe we have to make room for more story. Power narratives have driven the stories of Black women and Black babies for far too long in the MCH space, as we've addressed infant mortality and maternal mortality. In my advocacy work, I've heard people say over and over, take back your story, take back your story. But I've realized, even for myself, it's not my story they're telling. And it's actually my life that I need to take back. Because you see, I have the true story. Yes, I have the power, which is my story. You have the power, which is your story. So many in this space have to stop telling her story and do what Dr. Barfield and the CDC campaign is encouraging us to do, and that is to hear her. And we want to say, hear them lift up their voices. So I'm going to come back to you at the end of this session and the end of our time together. But right now, I'd like to hand off to Magda and Janelle as they share their stories today. So I look forward to seeing you in a few minutes, but let's hear the story from Magda. So Magda, I hand it to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to contribute to the 5th gathering of remarkable folks from across the country like you who are dedicating your time and your talent and your treasures to prevent pregnant people, women, from dying in the course of giving and sustaining life. I got to tell my part of today's opening session on strategic storytelling from Richmond, California. I live on the eastern shores of the San Francisco Bay, on and near original lands of the Ohlone peoples and other indigenous tribes whose sovereignty, integrity, and memories I pledge to honor. Today, I come to you as an enduring advocate for equitable health, racial justice, and greater well-being for all women and children, families, and fathers. I come as a seasoned academic and a credentialed data maven. I'm a serial social innovator. I've co-created ways and means that last, from City Match and perinatal periods of risk to regional public health leadership institutes, and even 2 new schools of public health. But mostly I come to you today because I profoundly believe in the power of stories. Today, I'm in my 3rd half of Car Talk. I've become an apprenticing and practice storyteller for social change. I aim to alter the narrative about who lives, who dies, and why, to lift up first-person voices and stories of people behind every data point, to make the point more powerfully, more passionately, more purposefully, to illustrate and inform and bring numerators and denominators to life, to anchor every rate, ratio, and proportion, every algebraic algorithm and artificial intelligence in human terms with another dimension of significance. My quest is to storify public health practice and to speak truth to power with stories. And most recently, as a seasoned strategist and in my storytelling, I've been working with the National Fetal and Infant Mortality Review work to bring stories into that methodology over the last 6, 8, 12 months amidst COVID. And now I'm tickled that the art and science of storytelling can serve to better connect and align community-based death review processes and other maternal and child health and public health methods. And in particular, hats off to Dr. Cheryl Clark, who's AmChip's Director of Equity and Epidemiology and Evaluation, who's on our design team for the Femur Stories Project, who made the connection to cross-pollinate between femur and the MMRCs so that we can have the connective tissue be our shared stories. So I'm inspired by the popular 5 Things I Know format that's been popping up, book talks and thrill lists and Instagram and the New York Times. And so I've come up with 5 things that I think that we should name first. Things that I've learned as your modern elder in public health, as a story midwife, from my mentors, my master teachers, from Urban Storytelling Fellowship, from studying neuroscience of story and trying to master strategic storytelling for social change. So please consider this an on your mark to establish a shared foundation, hopeful that together we will braid and blend our work for health and justice and equity through powerful storytelling and for greater impact together in the years ahead. So this is just an appetizer. So I'm looking forward to how we can get set more in the months ahead and years to come. So here goes. Well, I'll just take a breath. Number 1, Everybody is a story. That's a quote from Rachel Naomi Remen in her Kitchen Table Wisdom. You see, we've always been about story as humans, and all of us are natural storytellers. It is what we humans do. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio says about humans that we are challenged to make all this wisdom that we get understandable, transmissible, persuasive, enforceable. In a word, how do we get wisdom to stick? And the solution is storytelling. Our brains are hardwired to constantly make sense, to find meaning. It is about taking our lived experiences, ourselves, and making sense of the world around us. Every story is personal. Everyone has one. Everyone is one. So if you think, I'm not a storyteller, I can't take stories, I respectfully beg to differ. I ask you to summon the power of your story at this exquisite moment as you do your work for maternal mortality review and beyond. Number one. Number two, all stories are sacred. Sacred, to be honored and protected. You see, stories are among the oldest and deepest and most lasting form of human currency, to be passed down from generation to generation. I bet right now you hold a family story that's dear to you that you will never forget in your very pocket, in your soul. You see, stories are sacred, and therefore they need to be honored. We need guideposts and guardrails in this work, this ethical work, this sacred work. In the Femur Storytellings Initiative, we've created a foundations document that we're going to link to you after this MUM5 and see if we can do this work together using the same foundations of assumptions and promises we pledge to keep about how to keep those stories sacred. Because stories once told can both tickle and traumatize. And we need to know why we're telling this story now, to whom and for what end. And is it about us or is it about them? So remember, nothing about me without me. Your story, you get to tell your story. No one gets to tell your story without you. We got to figure out the basics and the sacredness of how we're going to make that happen. Number three, the strongest storytelling is guided by three things: science, art, and practice. Science. We need as storytellers to understand the evolutionary biology, the neuroscience of stories, how stories are memories that are passed down, memories to be recalled. Kendall Haven, in his book Story Smart, talks about how stories are how your brain is hardwired to make sense, just like we mentioned earlier. But they also anchor our beliefs. If you have a story that's already saved as memory, the only thing that will compel you to change your story, change your mind, is a replacement story, a better story that's more powerful, more believable, more effective than the original. And we have to learn to hone the art of crafting stories. Stories don't tell themselves. The best stories have a structure, an arc, characters and traits and motives, conflicts, dangers, problems to solve, struggles to wrestle with, moments that turn it on a dime and bring it home. It's like a symphony. It needs to be constructed, crafted, and learned, as I have learned from Ex Fabula and the poet laureate of Wisconsin, Dasha Kelly Hamilton, and great national poetry and storyteller Donald Washington, and great Jewish story Joel Benizzi, and so many others who've been teaching me, because stories stick with emotion. Maya Angelou said, I've learned that people will forget what you said. They will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you make them feel. Stories are about what make data turn into what people feel about what's happening. And last, we need stories, but we need better storytelling. And there's a practice of storytelling about what audience and how to make it universal and bring them on a ride with us. It requires an ability to not be swept away by our own emotions, and cultural humility that does not manipulate, exploit, or expropriate what is not yours to tell. Number 4, public storytelling, which is what we're talking about doing here in the MMRC work and in MUM5 as users. Public story is a powerful strategy tool for social change, especially in these times of stuck polarization and numbing numbers. PolicyLink has told us that data itself can never be social change. Data do not speak for themselves, but data combined with story can power bolder, smarter, more targeted strategies. Marshall Gantz from Harvard's Public Storytelling Project, his great quote is, because stories express our values. They give us a way to do this, not as abstract principles, but as lived experience. And only that will move others, not data. It's the story that moves. And last, I just want you to remember always that stories always put data in context. Without context, historical, cultural, societal, environmental, scientific, experiential, personal, spiritual. Stories without context are data, and stories not told in their own context will not stick and can have danger. These 5 things form a solid foundation for exploring together how to elevate and integrate powerful first-person stories and strategic storytelling into the MMRC and other related sentinel health events like fetal, infant, child, death review, morbidity review, HIV review, other of these where one sentinel event is going to try to compel us to understand better, to translate data into action, and in our case, to save women's lives. Everybody is a story. It's part of who and why we are. Every story is sacred currency, so we better set the guideposts and guardrails to keep us safe and ethical and effective. Every story told well has to incorporate the science of story, the art of crafting, and the practice to tell it well to have its greatest impact. 4, public storytelling requires strategies so that it can become policy that's ethical and sticks. And 5, always, always please hear and tell stories in their context. Told out of context is not told powerfully and not always ethical. These are my 5 that I want to tell you that I've learned in my weeks and months and years of doing this. I want to take this further with you. But to start, let's go more into the 5th part, which is the context. That's where we're going to go deeper today. I'd love to introduce you next to a younger colleague and brilliant teacher, a remarkable practicing midwife, lays hands on sacredly and scientifically and strategically and clinically brilliantly every other night almost. And she's going to come to you as a loving mom and my sister friend, Dr. Kenn L. Palacios. Let's listen to her as she combines insights with her own stories. 7 generations past, 7 generations forward, to have that part of the basic 5 stick even more. Thanks for being on your mark with us. May our creative collaborations continue to unfold as we strive to make a greater difference together through strategic storytelling for strong health, sustained breath, and long lives. Thanks so much.
Hustquex. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me today as I will share how story work and is an essential aspect of understanding data to address maternal infant mortality. Listed above are the 3 key objectives for today's talk. Before I begin this presentation formally, I want to acknowledge the ancestral land which I stand upon. My feet are resting on shared Pomo and Coast Miwok land. By bringing forth awareness that this land was once inhabited by thriving Indigenous communities, I am paying homage to their ancestors' memories, but also paying respect to those whom are still living and have been displaced by federal, state, and local policies. You all know this data very well. This is why we're here. Too many women die from pregnancy-related deaths in our country. Education is not protective for our most vulnerable populations, and as Black and American Indian women age, their maternal outcomes worsen. Additionally, Black and American Indian infants have the highest rates of sudden unexpected infant death syndrome. You can see by the breakdown by states, the highest sudden unexpected infant death rates seem to follow the most highly populated American Indian Alaska Native areas, the highest areas belonging to the Oklahoma and Alaska areas. My high alert warning for this presentation is that I will be covering some materials that may be triggering. I will discuss systemic structural racism, forced sterilization, and genocide. These topics contribute to the elephant in the room issues we encounter on a daily basis as we do our work. This presentation has done its job if it promotes discomfort and causes tension, providing fuel for growth on an individual level as well as on a team and organizational level. As I discuss interpreting data to address maternal infant mortality, I will be doing so by weaving my family's story throughout. This slide looks familiar. When reviewing cases, you see these types of descriptions assigned to each case. This is exactly what we see when we distill information to fit the boxes we have, to categorize people into neat, tiny data spreadsheets. This is what these cases look like when you see the people behind them. When we re-examine those descriptive boxes and scrutinize our agreed upon measured outcomes, we miss so much. These women are women I know. My grandmother, my mother, and myself. I am standing in for my best childhood friend, Tashina. Each of these 3 women were teen mothers. Combined, these women survived 8 preterm deliveries, 2 infant deaths, a coerced sterilization, suicidal ideation, alcoholism, abusive violent relationships, near misses and being murdered, poverty, and daily encounters steeped in racism. To receive better service, if you had money from your paycheck, a tank of gas, and reliable transportation, the choice to buy goods and services off reservation was always prioritized. One of these women chose to drive over 120 miles round trip to deliver her first child for fear of what she would encounter at the local hospital. This presentation will discuss each of these women's opportunities of maternal infant morbidity and mortality in terms of their life context, not their race, but their inherited histories, their launch in life, and the opportunities open to them in the life they lived. Their stories will help frame our understanding of how powerful the background story really is. One of the most important takeaways from today's presentation is to understand the significance of a person's lived experience and history in relation to caring for them. So I'll start with history, a marginalized history. Afterwards, I will discuss ongoing daily stressful effects from an Indigenous inherited history, which will include why it is challenging to have reportable data for this population. Following this, we will revisit these 3 women and explore their situations to better understand their maternal and infant outcomes. Have you ever wondered what the world looked like before settlers arrived to the Americas, and who were the Indigenous people and where they lived? Here is a map created a few years ago by Victor Temprano, a Canadian artist who had this to say: I feel that Western maps of Indigenous nations are often inherently colonial, and that they delegate power according to imposed borders that don't really exist in many nations throughout history. His map serves as a resource for settlers and non-Indigenous people to reframe Indigenous history. When I look at this map, a few things stick out. First, Temprano's map illustrates that vast space Indigenous groups moved within and how a number of tribes found ways to coexist on shared land. But also this map exposes my own internalized prejudice. Growing up in northwestern Montana, where my tribe has family members living in Canada, I always considered my cousins to the north as family. I was surrounded by messages that those from the south, such as Mexico, were not my kin and somehow less than. when in fact, they very are much a part of my Indigenous family. In other words, the border crossed us. And thinking back to the three women at the beginning of this presentation, how can we understand their maternal infant outcomes in context of their history? Does history matter? I would argue it does, and have since 2008. That ancestral history, along with current conditions as one's life, is central to understanding health. I will address 6 key historical events as listed on this slide that have dramatically impacted American Indian women's health. Now, before contact in 1492, the estimated conservative size of the Indigenous population was roughly about 60 million people in the North and Southern continent. In Europe, it was roughly 70 to 80 million people. This estimate is derived from equations that factor in how much agricultural land is required to sustain one person, and archaeological evidence around 1492 pointed out that about 10% of the total land mass was used agriculturally. By 1600, it is estimated that the Indigenous population lost 56 million people, largely to diseases brought across the Atlantic, such as smallpox, measles, influenza, and the bubonic plague. 90% of the Indigenous population was lost within 110 years, which roughly equates to 10% of the global population. For comparison, 80 million people died in World War II, accounting for about 3% of the global population lost. Now, for the remainder of my presentation, I will talk exclusively of the Indigenous people within the US, excluding Native Hawaiians. I use a few terms interchangeably. American Indian, Alaska Native are the same as Native American, Indigenous, and Indian. It is important to understand that how settlers colonized the local Indigenous populations varied widely and really reflected the worldview held by Europeans at the time, but also had lasting generational effects on communities today. For those colonized on the eastern seaboard, the general response was to first make friends and then push the Indigenous people away, farther away, westward. For those arriving in the southwestern part of the United States, the general response was to use religion and slavery to erode tribal identity. And those along the mountainous regions, along the northern part of the US bordering Canada, the general response of the fur trappers and Jesuit priests was to intermarry and convert tribes into Catholicism. Prior to 1871, the US government had treaties with different tribes, and it is precisely for this reason that a number of tribes today have been able to maintain a special status with the federal government. In exchange for giving up land, ceding land, tribes were given smaller plots of land called reservations, access to healthcare and education. Again, because my ancestors ceded our ancestral land and agreed to give up large portions of our traditional lands, my ancestors were relegated to reservations, imprisoned there, and given meager resources. The alternative was to fight and die. Some tribes did this, and they forfeited their federal recognition. As westward expansion continued and treaty making was happening, the Indigenous people were removed from their homelands, pushed farther west, and corralled onto smaller territories. This slide shows the largest organized force removal by the US government in 1830, called the Indian Removal Act, which was supported by President Andrew Jackson and passed by Congress. Over 100,000 men, women, children, and infants were given a martial escort, traversing over 5,000 miles across land and water to the Oklahoma Territory and forced onto reservations. This death march would later be named the Trail of Tears. It is estimated that between 4,000 and 8,000 men, women, children, and infants died of cold, hunger, and disease during this winter death march. This slide shows an example of traditional lands once held by the Sioux. You see the traditional lands of the Sioux, also known as the Nakota, Dakota, and Lakota. Originally in green, you can see their traditional lands across the Midwest, and currently the reservations are much smaller in a few states, predominantly in North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, and Nebraska. This slide shows you what happened over the span of 60 years, how so much land was lost or taken. And today, this is what the United States looks like when you look at the largest reservations across the United States. The purple highlights the reservations that are federally recognized, and it's really tough to see, but on the eastern seaboard, you see small state-recognized reservations. To facilitate assimilation, the government enacted the Dawes Act of 1887. This gave male heads of households individual parcels of land to farm, but also allowed tribes for the first time to outright sell land from the reservation to non-Indians. This shift in property ownership and ability to sell reservation land had disastrous results. and was reversed in the 1930s by the Indian New Deal. And for an astounding example of the devastating effects selling tribally held reservation land to white settlers and prospectors, I point you to the book Killers of the Flower Moon and Birth of the FBI. Additionally, the Dawes Act allowed the government to sell and give away land to settlers. This is an actual ad posted in 1911 by the U.S. Department of the Interior advertising reservation Indian land for sale. This slide represents the after effects of the Dawes Act on my reservation, a patchwork quilt of land held by my tribe. The green is land owned by my tribe. The light yellow is fee land, or land that was sold either by tribal members or by the U.S. government. Orange is land held in trust by the U.S. government for my tribe. Purple is federal land. The influx of Western settlers is also why the Educational Board and economic growth is heavily influenced by, if not largely controlled by, non-natives on my reservation. In the 1950s, again, the government tried to find solutions to the Indian problem. This time, to assimilate natives, they looked at terminating reservations by encouraging whole families to move to cities. This was called the Indian Relocation Act. Over 200,000 natives were displaced or relocated into cities like New York, Denver, LA, Minneapolis, Chicago, Seattle, San Francisco. This too proved disastrous, leaving entire families stranded in cities without promised support and lack of support to return to their communities, or completely dissolving their tribe. Today, 7 out of 10 American Indian people live in urban areas. Finally, in the 1970s, the federal government enacted a policy allowing tribes self-determination, the right to govern and police themselves, the right to decide what type of healthcare provisions their community needed. So far, I've talked about how the Indigenous population was decimated by warfare, disease, starvation. I followed this with a brief visual representation of forced removal and loss of land, along with some key cultural distinctions. Next, I will talk about the boarding school experience as another method of assimilation and genocide. Not long after the reservations were formed and Indigenous people were forced onto them, boarding schools were created. Oftentimes, these were religious-based boarding schools that were federally funded to educate children. One of the oldest Indian boarding schools, built in 1870,